The rain hammered against the windows of Neverland Ranch like bullets from the sky. Inside the sprawling estate, Michael Jackson sat alone in his private study, surrounded by golden records and lifetime achievement awards that seemed to mock him in the darkness. It was 3 a.m. on November 15th, 1995, and sleep had become a stranger to him. The pressures of fame, the constant accusations, the relentless media circus, all of it had pushed him to the edge of something he couldn't name. His hands trembled as he held a photograph of 3 children he'd met during a hospital visit in Los Angeles just weeks earlier. Their faces haunted him, especially one face. A little girl named Sophia, barely 8 years old, with eyes that had seen too much pain for someone so young. Sophia had been in the pediatric cancer ward, fighting a battle that seemed impossible to win. But it wasn't the cancer that kept Michael awake at night. It was what she had whispered to him when the cameras stopped rolling and the photographers left the room. She grabbed his sleeve with her tiny, frail fingers and pulled him close. Her words came out in a desperate rush, so quiet that only he could hear them. She told him about her stepfather, about the things that happened when her mother worked the night shift, about the bruises hidden beneath her hospital gown, about how she'd almost been grateful for the cancer because it meant she could stay in the hospital, away from him. Michael's blood had run cold. He'd wanted to scream, to call the police right then and there, but Sophia had begged him not to. She was terrified of what would happen if anyone found out she'd told. Her stepfather had connections, she said. He was a wealthy man, respected in the community. Nobody would believe a sick little girl over him. Michael had promised her he would help. He'd looked into those frightened eyes and sworn on everything he held sacred that he would find a way to save her. But weeks had passed, and he'd been drowning in his own legal troubles, his own scandals. The world was calling him a monster while a real monster was hurting an innocent child, and he felt paralyzed by his own infamy. Who would listen to him? Who would believe him? He'd tried going through proper channels, making anonymous calls to Child Protective Services, but nothing had happened. The system had failed her. His security chief, a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, had done some digging and discovered that Sophia's stepfather, Richard Castellano, was indeed a man with power. He owned a chain of luxury hotels across California and had judges, politicians, and police officers in his pocket. He was untouchable, or so everyone thought. Tonight, everything had come to a head. Marcus had burst into Michael's study 2 hours ago with news that made his heart stop. Sophia had been released from the hospital earlier that day. Her latest round of chemotherapy had been completed, and despite her silent pleas to the nurses, despite her tears, she'd been sent home. Home to him. Marcus had a contact inside the hospital who'd seen the terror in Sophia's eyes as her stepfather had practically dragged her out of the building. The contact had tried to intervene, questioning whether it was safe for Sophia to leave, but Castellano had produced impeccable paperwork, doctor's orders, and a smile that could charm snakes. Within hours, Marcus's street sources had reported something that made both men's blood boil. Castellano was hosting one of his infamous private parties at his estate in the Hollywood Hills. These weren't ordinary parties. They were gatherings where the rich and corrupt came to indulge in their darkest desires, far from public scrutiny. Michael stood up from his desk, the photograph of Sophia still clutched in his hand. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window, a face the whole world thought they knew, but truly didn't. They saw the eccentric performer, the bizarre headlines, the carefully constructed image. They didn't see the man who lay awake at night agonizing over every child he couldn't save, every letter from a suffering kid that he couldn't personally answer. He'd built Neverland as a sanctuary, a place where children could be children, where innocence could be protected. But what good was any of it if he couldn't save one little girl who trusted him with her terrible secret? The awards on his walls suddenly felt like worthless pieces of metal and glass. All the #1 hits, all the sold-out stadiums, all the screaming fans. None of it mattered if he couldn't use his resources, his determination, his sheer stubborn will to do what was right. Marcus entered the study without knocking, his face grim. He was a tall man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much darkness in his years with the Bureau. He'd left federal service after becoming disillusioned with bureaucracy that protected predators more often than it stopped them. Working for Michael had given him a new purpose. The singer might be strange, might be misunderstood, but Marcus had never doubted his heart. He'd seen Michael weep over news stories about abused children. He'd watched him empty his bank accounts for causes that would never make headlines. This was a man who genuinely cared, sometimes to his own detriment. Marcus carried a folder filled with surveillance photos and floor plans. He dropped them on Michael's desk with a heavy thud. The images showed Castellano's fortress-like mansion, complete with security guards, surveillance cameras, and high walls. It looked impenetrable. It was designed to keep secrets in and justice out. Michael picked up the photos one by one, studying them with an intensity that surprised even Marcus. The security chief had expected his employer to defer to his expertise, to let the professional handle the planning. Instead, he saw something awakening in Michael's eyes, a fierce determination that transformed his usually gentle features into something almost frightening. This wasn't the shy, soft-spoken man the public occasionally glimpsed. This was someone who'd made impossible dreams reality through sheer force of will. Someone who'd conquered the world's biggest stages despite every obstacle thrown in his path. Someone who'd survived industry shocks, family dysfunction, and global scrutiny. If anyone could pull off what Marcus was thinking, it was this man. But it would require Michael to risk everything: his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life. The plan forming between them in that rain-soaked study was audacious, probably illegal, and completely insane. They were going to break into Richard Castellano's mansion during his party, find Sophia, and extract her before anyone realized what had happened. The clock on the wall ticked toward 4 in the morning. Outside, the storm intensified, as if nature itself was responding to the magnitude of what they were planning. Michael looked at Marcus and spoke words that would set everything in motion, words that came from somewhere deep in his soul. He said them quietly, but with absolute conviction. He told Marcus to gather the team, to prepare everything they would need, and to do it fast. They had one shot at this, one chance to do something that mattered more than any record he'd ever released. Sophia had trusted him with her secret, with her pain, with her hope. He would not let her down. Even if the whole world condemned him for it, even if this destroyed what remained of his tattered reputation, he would save that little girl. The rain continued to fall as 2 men bent over floor plans and photographs, plotting a rescue that would require precision, courage, and a miracle. Neither of them knew if they'd survive what was coming, but both of them knew they had to try. Dawn broke over Neverland Ranch with reluctant light filtering through storm clouds that refused to leave. Michael hadn't slept. Instead, he'd spend the remaining hours before sunrise making phone calls to people he trusted with his life. These weren't the typical members of his entourage, not managers or publicists or yes-men looking for their next paycheck. These were the handful of individuals who'd proven their loyalty in ways that mattered. People who'd seen him at his lowest and hadn't sold stories to tabloids. People who understood that beneath the headlines and hysteria was someone who genuinely tried to make the world better. The first person to arrive was James Chen, a stunt coordinator Michael had worked with on several music videos. James was a compact man in his 40s with a background in military special operations before Hollywood had discovered his talents. He'd choreographed some of Michael's most dangerous performance sequences, and more importantly, he knew how to move through spaces without being detected. Michael trusted him completely. The second arrival came just after 7 in the morning. Dr. Sarah Mitchell pulled up to Neverland's gates in a modest sedan that belied her importance to this mission. She was a pediatrician who volunteered at the same hospital where Michael had met Sophia. Sarah had actually been the one to introduce them, thinking that a visit from the King of Pop might lift the spirits of her young patient. She'd witnessed their conversation and had noticed Sophia's distress when it was time to go home. Something about it had bothered her, the way the little girl's face had fallen, the way she tried to find reasons to extend her hospital stay. When Marcus had contacted her the previous night and explained what they'd learned, Sarah hadn't hesitated. She'd violated patient confidentiality by confirming what she'd suspected but couldn't prove, that Sophia's injuries didn't all match her cancer treatment. There had been bruises and patterns that suggested grabbing, marks that told stories doctors were trained to read. But without Sophia speaking up, without evidence that could override a powerful man's lawyers, Sarah's hand had been tied. Until now, Marcus had spent the early morning hours recruiting 2 more essential team members. The first was Tommy Rodriguez, a security expert who'd worked with Marcus back in their FBI days. Tommy had left the bureau under circumstances that remained classified, but Marcus knew his friend's departure had involved choosing between following orders and following his conscience. Tommy had chosen conscience and had been quietly forced out. Since then, he'd made a living installing security systems for the wealthy elite of Los Angeles, which meant he knew exactly how those systems worked and how to defeat them. He'd installed systems in homes similar to Castellano's mansion. He understood the technology, the blind spots, the human factors that made even the best security vulnerable. When Marcus had explained the situation, Tommy had asked only one question. Was the little girl really in danger? When Marcus confirmed it, Tommy had simply said he was in. The final member of their team was perhaps the most unexpected. Nicole Hartley was a social worker who'd been fighting the system for 15 years, trying to protect children from monsters who were behind respectability and money. She'd crossed paths with Michael at various charity events and had been one of the few people who'd publicly defended him during his darkest times. Not because she was a fan, but because she'd actually investigated the accusations against him and found them baseless. She recognized a witch hunt when she saw one, and she recognized genuine compassion when she encountered it. Nicole had dealt with men like Richard Castellano before, predators who use their wealth and influence to escape consequences. She'd seen too many cases fall apart, too many children sent back to dangerous homes because the system protected the powerful. When Marcus called her, she didn't need convincing. She needed details. Within an hour, she'd driven to Neverland with a briefcase full of legal documents, emergency custody papers, and contacts within Child Protective Services who owed her favors. If they succeeded in getting Sophia out, Nicole would make sure the girl never had to go back. The 6 of them gathered in Michael's private movie theater, the only room in Neverland large enough for what they needed to plan, and secure enough for complete privacy. Marcus had already swept it for listening devices. Paranoia was an occupational requirement in Michael's world, where unauthorized biographies and tell-all interviews had taught them all to be careful. The floor plans of Castellano's mansion covered the walls, pinned up like battle maps. Satellite images showed the property's layout, the surrounding streets, the possible escape routes. Tommy had managed to obtain the specs for Castellano's security system through his industry contacts, and what they showed was daunting. Motion sensors covered every approach. Cameras monitored every entrance. The property had its own backup generator, making a simple power cut useless. Guards patrolled in rotating patterns designed to eliminate blind spots. Breaking into this place wasn't just difficult. It bordered on impossible. Michael stood before the assembled group, feeling the weight of what he was asking them to do. These people had lives, families, careers that could be destroyed if this went wrong. They could be arrested for breaking and entering, kidnapping, assault if things got physical. Castellano's lawyers would destroy them. The media would crucify them. And if something happened to Sophia during the rescue attempt, if she got hurt because of her actions, Michael knew he'd never forgive himself. He looked at each face and tone, seeing resolve reflected back at him. These weren't reckless people. They understood the risks. They were here anyway. He began to speak, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. He told them everything Sophia had whispered to him in that hospital room. He didn't spare details because they needed to understand exactly what they were saving her from. Sarah confirmed the medical evidence she'd observed. Nicole added case details about Castellano that painted a picture of a serial predator who'd been operating with impunity for years. Other children had hinted at abuse, but their testimonies had been suppressed, their families paid off or threatened into silence. The plan they developed over the next several hours was elaborate and terrifying in its complexity. They would infiltrate Castellano's party that evening using Tommy's connections to the catering company hired for the event. Michael would be smuggled in with the catering staff, his appearance disguised to the point where even his own fans wouldn't recognize him. It killed him to hide his face, to use the very anonymity he'd lost decades ago as a tool, but it was necessary. James would enter separately, posing as additional security that Castellano's head of security had supposedly hired without informing his boss, a bureaucratic confusion that Tommy would engineer through falsified communications. Sarah would arrive as she'd been invited. Castellano cultivated relationships with medical professionals to maintain his respectable facade, and she'd received an invitation weeks ago that she planned to ignore. Now it was their way in. Nicole would remain outside as their emergency contact, ready to mobilize legal resources the moment they had Sophia. Marcus would coordinate everything from a surveillance van positioned 3 blocks away, monitoring communications and security feeds that Tommy would hack into. The most dangerous part would be locating Sophia inside the mansion. The house had 23 rooms spread across 3 floors, plus a basement that Tommy's blueprint showed was recently renovated with soundproofing. That detail had made everyone's blood run cold. Soundproof basements in the homes of suspected predators rarely meant anything good. They had to assume Sophia would be kept somewhere out of sight of the party guests, hidden away like a terrible secret. Michael would have to search for her while avoiding dozens of guests and security personnel, any one of whom might recognize him despite his disguise. If he was discovered before they found Sophia, the whole mission would fail. Castellano would be alerted, security would be tightened, and their one chance would be lost. The little girl would disappear into a system designed to protect her abuser, and Michael knew he'd spend the rest of his life haunted by his failure. As the day wore on, they refined every detail. Communication devices were distributed, tiny A-pieces that would keep them connected. Tommy worked on creating loop feeds for security cameras, giving them windows of opportunity to move through the mansion undetected. James choreographed extraction routes, timing how long it would take to move from various rooms to the service exit that identified as their best escape path. Sarah prepared medical supplies in case Sophia needed immediate care. Nicole had backup plans for their backup plans, legal argument prepared, contact alerted, and standing by. And Michael tried to quiet the voice in his head that kept asking what right he had to put all these people in danger. But then he'd look at Sophia's photograph, remember the desperation in her eyes, and know that doing nothing was worse than any risk they might face. By late afternoon, the storm had finally passed, leaving Los Angeles under clear skies that felt like a mockery of what they were about to do. Michael stood in his bedroom, looking at the disguise laid out on his bed. A dark wig, colored contact lenses, prosthetic pieces that would alter his cheekbones and nose, clothing so unlike his usual style that even close friends wouldn't recognize him. He'd spent his entire adult life being Michael Jackson, that identity consuming everything else about him. Tonight, he had become someone completely different. Someone ordinary, invisible, forgettable. He had to become the person he'd always secretly wished he could be, someone who could walk through the world unnoticed. As he began applying the disguise, his hands were steadier than they'd been all day. The fear was still there, but it had transformed into something else. Purpose, determination, an unshakable conviction that what they were about to do was right, even if the law said otherwise. Sometimes justice existed outside courtrooms and legal procedures. Sometimes it required ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Michael looked at his transformed reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. Perfect. That was exactly what they needed. The king of pop disappeared, and in his place stood a weapon aimed at saving one little girl's life. The sun set over the Hollywood Hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the ugliness they were about to confront. Michael sat in the back of an unmarked catering van, surrounded by food warmers and covered serving trays. The disguise itched terribly. The prosthetics pulled at his skin. The wig felt foreign and uncomfortable, but when he caught glimpses of himself in the van's reflective surfaces, he saw a stranger. Middle-aged, unremarkable, the kind of face you'd pass in a crowd without a second glance. Tommy had done excellent work. Next to him, James adjusted his own disguise, a security guard's uniform complete with an A-piece and the kind of stone-faced expression that marked professional muscle. They didn't speak during the drive. There wasn't anything left to say. Every contingency had been planned for. Every possible scenario had been discussed. Now it came down to execution and luck. The van turned onto Mulholland Drive, and through the tinted windows, Michael caught glimpses of mansions that represented everything he'd come to despise about wealth. These weren't homes built for families and love and laughter. They were fortresses designed to hide secrets, monuments to excess built on the suffering of others. Castellano's estate came into view, and even from the street, it radiated menace. High walls surrounded the property, topped with decorative iron spikes that were probably electrified. The main gate was a masterpiece of intimidating architecture, all sharp angles and dark metal. Security cameras tracked their approach, and Marcus's voice crackled in Michael's hidden earpiece, confirming that Tommy's loop feeds were active. They had a 30-second window before real footage resumed. The van passed through the gate into a world designed to cater to the darkest appetites of the wealthy elite. The mansion itself was a sprawling Mediterranean-style structure that had probably cost more than most people would own in 10 lifetimes. Warm light spilled from its many windows, and the sounds of a party in full swing drifted across the manicured grounds. Laughter, music, the clink of expensive crystal, all the sounds of people enjoying themselves while somewhere in this house a little girl was terrified. The contrast made Michael's stomach turn. The van pulled around to the service entrance, and suddenly they were in motion. Catering staff poured out of the vehicle, carrying trays and equipment, and Michael moved with them, his body remembering every choreographed movement James had drilled into them. Head down, purposeful stride, looking like he belonged. Security guards watched from their posts, but their eyes slid past the servers with barely a glance. Rich people never really looked at those who served them. That invisibility was their greatest weapon tonight. Inside, the service corridors were a sharp contrast to the luxury of the main house. Plain walls, utilitarian lighting, the unglamorous machinery that kept wealth running smoothly. Staff rushed past carrying champagne and hors d'oeuvres, too busy to notice one more forgettable face among them. Michael's earpiece crackled with Marcus's steady voice, guiding him through the layout. Sarah had entered through the front entrance minutes ago, playing her role as an invited guest perfectly. She was already circulating through the party, her trained eyes searching for any sign of Sophia while making polite conversation with monsters in expensive suits. James had split off, taking his position in the security rotation with a kind of confidence that made questions unnecessary. Tommy was in the surveillance van with Marcus, his fingers flying across keyboards as he battled Castellano's security systems in real time. Every locked door, every camera feed, every electronic obstacle. Tommy was a key to all of it. Michael reached the service stairwell and paused, listening. Above him, the party continued. Below him, the basement core with its terrible implications. Marcus's voice in his had confirmed what his instincts already told him. Heat signatures from Tommy's thermal imaging showed one small figure in the basement, alone in a corner room. Sophia. She was exactly where they'd feared she'd be, hidden away in the soundproof depths of the house while her abuser entertained upstairs. Michael's hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. Every instinct screamed at him to run down there, to get to her immediately, but training and planning held him back. Jamesy's voice joined Marcus's, confirming that the basement level had guards stationed at key points. They needed to draw those guards away before Michael could attempt entry. Sarah would create a distraction upstairs, nothing dramatic, just enough commotion to pull resources toward the main party. A spilled drink on an important guest, perhaps, or a small medical emergency that would require security's attention. Minutes ticked by like hours. Michael pressed himself against the stairwell wall, listening to footsteps pass on the other side of the door, his heart hammering so hard he was certain someone would hear it. The disguise that had seemed so complete now felt paper-thin. Any second, someone would look at him and know. They'd see through the prosthetics and the wig and recognize the most famous face in the world. Then everything would fall apart. Sophia would be lost, and all of this would have been for nothing. He closed his eyes and tried to center himself the way he did before performances, finding that calm space in his mind where fear couldn't reach. But this wasn't a performance. There was no safety net, no do-overs if he missed a step. This was real, and the stakes were life and death. Sarah's voice came through the earpiece, steady and calm. She was ready. She positioned herself near one of Castellano's business associates, a man with a heart condition that Sarah had discovered through casual conversation. All it would take was suggesting he looked unwell, expressing concern, and security would converge to ensure their host's important guest received attention. It was elegant in its simplicity, the kind of distraction that would seem completely natural. Michael heard her execute the plan perfectly, her voice rising in alarm as she called for help. Through the walls, he heard the response, heavy footsteps running, security personnel responding to potential crisis. Tommy confirmed the basement level was now understaffed. 2 guards had moved toward the main party, leaving one station at the primary basement entrance. James was already moving to neutralize that obstacle. The word came. Go. Michael slipped through the service door and down the basement stairs, moving with a grace that years of dancing had made second nature. The basement corridor was dimly lit, and the soundproofing that had been installed here muffled the party sounds to barely a whisper. Door after door lined the hallway, and Michael had to resist the urge to open them all, to see what other horrors might be hidden here. His mission was singular. Find Sophia. Get her out. Everything else was secondary. Tommy guided him to the right door, having tracked the heat signature to a room at the end of the corridor. Michael's hand touched the doorknob, and he felt electricity run through him. On the other side of this door was a little girl who trusted him with a terrible secret. He was either about to save her or fail her spectacularly. The door opened silently. Tommy had remotely unlocked it, bypassing the electronic lock. The room beyond was small, windowless, with walls that had indeed been soundproofed. It was furnished with disturbing care, a child's bedroom recreated in this underground prison, complete with toys and a small bed. And there, curled up in the corner with her arms wrapped around her knees, was Sophia. She looked even smaller than she had in the hospital, wearing a white dress that made her look like some Victorian ghost. Her hair had been brushed and styled, and she wore makeup that was grotesque on someone so young, a doll being prepared for purposes that made Michael's soul scream. When she heard the door open, she flinched, trying to make herself even smaller, and the fear in that instinctive reaction told him everything about what she'd endured here. Michael pulled off a wig and removed the colored contacts, letting her see his face. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by confusion, then desperate hope. She whispered his name like a prayer, as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her, keeping his movement slow and non-threatening despite the urgency screaming through his veins. He told her she was safe now, that he'd come to take her away from here, that she never had to be afraid again. She stared at him with eyes that had grown too old too fast, and he saw the moment she decided to trust him. She reached out with those tiny hands and grabbed his sleeve just like she had in the hospital, but this time when she spoke, her voice was stronger. She said she'd known he would come. She'd known he wouldn't forget his promise. The moment was shattered by Marcus's urgent voice in the earpiece. They had a problem. Castellano had left the party, and security cameras showed him heading toward the basement. Their window was collapsing. They had maybe 90 seconds before he reached this corridor. Michael scooped Sophia up, feeling how light she was, how fragile. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder, and he felt her trembling. Jamesy's voice joined Marcus's, coordinating their extraction. The route they planned was compromised. They needed to improvise. Tommy was mapping alternate paths in real time, searching for a way out that wouldn't put them directly in Castellano's path. Sarah was trying to redirect him, but the man seemed to have a sixth sense that something was wrong. He was moving with purpose, and behind him, security personnel were falling into formation. Michael ran. The choreography of his performances, the countless hours of rehearsal and physical training, all of it came together in this moment as he moved through the basement corridors with Sophia in his arms. Tommy called out turns, warning him of cameras and guards. James had abandoned his cover and was actively blocking pursuit, using his military training to create obstacles and delays. Sarah's voice was tense as she tried to contain the situation upstairs, keeping party guests from becoming aware of the chaos erupting below their feet. Nicole checked in from outside, confirming that Child Protective Services was standing by, that lawyers were ready, that the moment they cleared the property with Sophia, a legal wall would slam down that even Castellano's money would struggle to breach. But first they had to get out. A service elevator offered their best chance. Tommy overrode the controls, bringing it down to the basement level and holding it open. Michael could hear shouting behind him now, Castellano's voice raised in fury as he discovered the empty room. The man knew. He knew someone had taken his victim, and the rage in his voice promised terrible things. Michael reached the elevator just as James appeared from a side corridor, breathing hard, his security uniform torn. He'd been in a fight, and from the look of him, the other guy had come out worse. They piled into the elevator together, and Tommy sent it up to the ground floor service area. 30 seconds. That's all the time they had before Castellano security locked down the entire property. 30 seconds to cross from the service area to the side gate that led to the catering parking area. 30 seconds to get Sophia to safety. They burst from the elevator into chaos. Someone had pulled a fire alarm, Nicole's doing, creating confusion among the party guests. Wealthy elites in designer clothes milled around in annoyed confusion, blocking corridors and demanding explanations. Michael used the chaos as cover, moving through the crowd with Sophia still clutched against him. She hadn't made a sound since he'd picked her up, but he could feel her heart racing against his chest. James cleared a path, his intimidating presence making people step aside. And then they were outside, cool night air hitting them like freedom itself. The catering van was running, Nicole behind the wheel. They'd switched drivers, abandoning subtlety for speed. Michael dove into the back with Sophia, James right behind them, and then they were moving, the van accelerating toward the gate that was already beginning to close. The van hit the closing gate at precisely the angle Tommy had calculated, using momentum in the vehicle's reinforced frame to force it open just enough to squeeze through. Metal screamed against metal. Sparks flew, and then they were on Mulholland Drive, the mansion's alarm shrieking behind them. Nicole drove like she was competing in a race, her knuckles white on the steering wheel as she navigated the winding road with controlled precision. In the back, Michael held Sophia close, whispering reassurances while his mind raced through everything that would happen next. They'd just kidnapped a child from a private residence. It didn't matter that they were saving her from abuse. Legally, they were criminals now. Castellano's lawyers would be mobilizing within minutes, and despite Nicole's preparations, the legal battle ahead would be brutal. Marcus's voice came through the earpiece with urgent instructions. They couldn't go to the nearest police station. Castellano's influence was too strong there. Instead, Nicole was heading to the downtown FBI field office, where Marcus had contacts who'd worked cases against powerful predators and understood how the system could be corrupted. It was a 40-minute drive through Los Angeles traffic, and during that time, every second mattered. Castellano would be calling in favors, spinning narratives, preparing to paint them as delusional vigilantes who'd stolen his stepdaughter based on the fantasies of a sick child. He'd have PR firms crafting statements. He'd have police sympathetic to him issuing arrest warrants. The race wasn't just physical now. It was legal, political, a battle fought on terrain where money and influence mattered more than truth. Sophia finally spoke, her voice muffled against Michael's shoulder. She asked if it was really over, if she really didn't have to go back. The heartbreak in that question, the disbelief that she might actually be free, cut Michael deeper than any tabloid headline ever had. He told her she was safe now, that he'd made a promise and he always kept his promises. Sarah, who'd escaped the mansion separately and met them at a prearranged rendezvous point, moved to the back of the van to examine Sophia. Her trained eyes scanned for injuries, and what she found made her jaw tighten. Bruises in various stages of healing, signs of trauma both physical and psychological. She documented everything with her phone's camera, creating evidence that would be crucial in the legal fight ahead. Each photograph was another nail in Castellano's coffin, proof that would be harder to dismiss than a child's testimony alone. The city lights of Los Angeles blurred past the van's windows as Nicole navigated through traffic. James sat near the back doors, watching for any sign of pursuit. Castellano's security was probably scrambling, trying to locate them, but Tommy's technical wizardry had disabled the tracking devices on the catering van before they'd ever left Neverland that morning. Still, they couldn't afford to be complacent. Men with that much power didn't give up easily, especially when their darkest secrets were being dragged into the light. Michael's phone began ringing, not his personal line, but the secure phone Marcus had given him for this mission. He answered, knowing before Marcus spoke that the news wouldn't be good. Castellano had indeed called the police, reporting a kidnapping. He'd spun a story about an obsessed celebrity who'd become delusionally fixated on his stepdaughter during a hospital visit. He was claiming Michael had mental health issues, citing the singer's well-documented eccentricities and past scandals as evidence. The media was already picking up the story. Marcus could hear the police scanners lighting up with reports, could see news vans being dispatched. Within the hour, this would be the biggest story in the country. Michael Jackson accused of kidnapping a child. The headlines wrote themselves, and every word would reinforce the narrative Castellano was building. The irony was devastating. Michael, who'd spent his entire career celebrating childhood innocence, who'd been falsely accused of heinous act before, was now being painted as a monster while trying to save a victim from an actual predator. He looked down at Sophia, who'd finally relaxed enough to close her eyes, her small body trusting him to keep her safe. For her, he'd endure whatever was coming. Let them destroy his reputation again. Let them call him crazy. None of it mattered as long as she was free. Nicole pulled into the underground parking garage of the FBI field office downtown. Marcus was already there, waiting with 2 federal agents he'd worked with during his time at the Bureau. Special Agent Maria Reyes and Special Agent David Park both had reputations as investigators who couldn't be bought. They'd built careers prosecuting human trafficking cases and child exploitation rings, often fighting against bureaucratic resistance and political pressure. When Marcus had contacted them with the situation, they'd agreed to meet despite the late hour and the explosive nature of what they were being asked to handle. As the van doors opened, Michael saw their expressions shift from skepticism to concern as Sarah carried out documentation of Sophia's injuries. Whatever they'd expected, the evidence was clearly more substantial than Castellano's PR machine would want people to know. The next 6 hours were a blur of statements, medical examinations, and legal maneuvering. Sophia was placed in emergency protective custody, moved to a secure facility where Castellano couldn't reach her while Child Protective Services investigated. Nicole unleashed her network of contacts, and suddenly judges were being woken up, emergency hearings were being scheduled, and the machinery of justice that usually moved so slowly was accelerating. Sarah's documentation proved crucial. Medical evidence that corroborated Sophia's account, injuries that couldn't be explained away by cancer treatment or normal childhood accidents. Agent Reyes took Michael's statement personally, listening without judgment as he explained everything that had led to this moment. She was particularly interested in the fact that Michael had tried to go through proper channels first, that his breaking into Castellano's home had been an act of desperation after the system failed. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, Michael sat in a conference room at the FBI office, exhausted beyond measure but unable to rest. Through the windows, he could see news helicopters circling, media vans positioning themselves for the story they were preparing to tell. His lawyer had arrived sometime around 3 a.m, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh who defended him during previous legal troubles. She was blunt about their situation. Castellano was pressing charges, kidnapping, breaking and entering, assault on his security personnel. The district attorney would be under pressure to prosecute, especially given Michael's celebrity. Even with the evidence of abuse, even with Sophia's testimony, Michael had broken laws. Jennifer could fight the charges, could argue necessity in defense of another, but it would be a battle fought in courtrooms and in the media simultaneously. The worst part was awaiting. Sophia was being evaluated by forensic specialists who worked with traumatized children. The process couldn't be rushed. Pushing her too hard could re-traumatize her, and any evidence they collected needed to be bulletproof because Castellano's lawyers would attack every aspect of it. Michael wanted to see her, to make sure she was okay, but protocols kept them separated. She was a victim now, officially, and he was technically her kidnapper until the legal system sorted through the mess they created. The irony of it ate at him. He'd saved her life, but the very act of saving her had put him in a position where he might not be able to protect her through what came next. James, Tommy, and Sarah were in separate rooms giving their own statements. All of them faced potential charges. All of them had known the risks and chosen to help anyway, but that didn't make watching them suffer consequences any easier. Marcus sat across from Michael, his face showing the strain of the night. He'd been fielding calls from media outlets, from Michael's management team, from worried friends who'd seen the breaking news. The story was everywhere now, dominating every channel. Most outlets were running with Castellano's narrative, wealthy businessman stepdaughter taken by troubled celebrity in bizarre incident. The fuller story, the truth about what Sophia had endured, was being drowned out by sensationalism and the gravitational pull of Michael's fame. Some reporters were digging deeper, questioning why FBI agents were involved, why Child Protective Services had immediately placed Sophia in emergency custody, but those details were footnotes and stories designed to generate clicks and views. The world wanted a simple narrative, and Michael Jackson kidnaps child was simpler than the ugly reality of how well protected predators. Agent Reyes returned to the conference room with news that shifted everything. Sophia had spoken to the forensic interviewer, and what she'd revealed was worse than anyone had imagined. Castellano hadn't just abused his stepdaughter. There had been other children over the years, victims who'd been paid off or silenced. Sophia knew about them because Castellano had threatened her with their fates, telling her what happened to little girls who told secrets. The FBI was now opening a full investigation into Castellano, one that reached beyond a single child into patterns of predation that stretched back years. Suddenly, Michael's break-in wasn't just about saving one girl. It had potentially exposed a serial predator who'd operated with impunity for decades. The evidence Sophia provided, combined with what the FBI would now uncover, could bring down not just Castellano but potentially the network of enablers who protected him. The media narrative began shifting around midday. Someone leaked details of Sophia's medical examination to the press. Jennifer suspected it was Agent Reyes or one of her colleagues, frustrated by how the story was being told. Suddenly, reporters had evidence that contradicted the simple kidnapping narrative. Sophia's injuries became public knowledge. Questions arose about why a wealthy man's stepdaughter had bruises that doctors characterized as consistent with sustained physical abuse. Child advocacy groups began issuing statements supporting Michael's actions. Domestic violence organizations pointed out that this was exactly what happened when the system failed victims. Desperate people took desperate measures. The tide was turning, but it was turning slowly, and the damage to Michael's already fragile reputation was severe. Death threats poured into his management office. Angry calls accused him of using his fame to avoid consequences. Others praised him as a hero. The public was divided, passionate, and loud. Jennifer laid out their legal strategy. They'd fight the criminal charges by putting Castellano on trial instead, exposing his abuse and arguing that Michael's actions were legally justified as defense of another. It was risky. Judges didn't like vigilante justice, even when the vigilante had good intentions. But with Sophia's testimony and the medical evidence, they had a fighting chance. The bigger concern was civil litigation. Castellano could sue for damages, claiming emotional distress, property damage, defamation. Even if they won the criminal case, Michael could be fighting civil suits for years. The financial cost would be enormous, but Michael didn't hesitate. He told Jennifer to prepare for every fight, to spare no expense. Money was meaningless compared to Sophia's safety and exposing the truth about Castellano. If this bankrupted him, so be it. Some things mattered more than wealth. Nicole arrived with an update that brought the first genuine relief Michael had felt in 24 hours. Sophia's mother had been located and informed of everything that had transpired. The woman had been working multiple jobs to support her daughter's medical care, often away from home during night shifts when the abuse occurred. She had suspicions but had been gaslighted by Castellano, manipulated into doubting her own instincts. When confronted with the evidence, she'd broken down and revealed her own history. Castellano had been psychologically abusing her for years, controlling her through financial dependency and threats. She wanted nothing more than to protect her daughter and was fully cooperating with authorities. She'd already filed for divorce and was seeking a restraining order. Most importantly, she didn't blame Michael. She thanked him through tears, grateful that someone had finally listened to her daughter when so many others had looked away. As the day wore on, more pieces fell into place. Tommy's technical expertise had captured security footage from inside Castellano's mansion, evidence that showed the soundproof basement, the disturbing room where Sophia had been kept, other rooms that suggested more victims. Agent Park were coordinating with local police to execute search warrants, and what they were finding painted a picture of depravity that shocked even seasoned investigators. Financial records showed payments to families of other children, non-disclosure agreements that were essentially hush money. Castellano's empire was crumbling, and the man himself had gone silent, his lawyers advising him to say nothing as criminal charges loomed. The predator who'd seemed untouchable was discovering that even wealth had limits when federal investigators and public outrage aligned against him. Michael was finally allowed to see Sophia late that afternoon. She was staying in a child-friendly facility, surrounded by counselors and protected by security. When he entered the room where she waited, Sophia ran to him and hugged him with a strength that belied her small frame. She told him she'd told him everything, all the terrible things she'd been too afraid to speak before. She'd been brave because he'd been brave for her. Seeing her smile, hearing relief in her voice instead of fear, made every consequence worth it. They sat together, and he answered her questions about what happened next. She'd stay in protective custody until the court decided permanent placement. Her mother was fighting to regain custody, working with counselors to address the trauma they'd both endured. Sophia would need therapy, support, time to heal, but for the first time in years, she had hope. She asked Michael if he'd visit her sometimes, and he promised he would, as often as the courts and circumstances allowed. That evening, Michael stood before a hastily arranged press conference. Jennifer had advised against it, but he insisted. The world deserved to hear the truth directly from him, not filtered through lawyers and PR statements. He stood at a podium in the FBI field office, cameras from every major network trained on him, and spoke from his heart. He didn't defend his actions as legal or proper. He acknowledged breaking laws and understood he'd face consequences. but he refused to apologize for saving a child's life. He spoke about Sophia without naming her, protecting her privacy while revealing enough truth to counter Castellano's narrative. He talked about a system that failed vulnerable children, about wealth that purchased immunity from justice, about the moral obligation every adult had to protect kids who couldn't protect themselves. His voice cracked with emotion as he described hearing Sophia's desperate whisper in that hospital room, and knowing he had to act. The speech went viral within minutes. Some called it a confession of criminal activity. Others called it the most honest moment of moral clarity they'd heard from a public figure. Child abuse hotlines reported surges in calls from victims emboldened by Sophia's story. Legislators promised to investigate how Castellano had evaded scrutiny for so long. And in living rooms across America, parents hugged their children a little tighter, thinking about the little girl who'd been brave enough to whisper her secret to someone who actually listened. Michael didn't watch the coverage. He returned to the conference room where his team waited: Marcus, James, Tommy, Sarah, Nicole, and Jennifer. These people had risked everything for a child they barely knew because it was right. They faced possible charges and certain public scrutiny, but looking at their faces, Michael saw no regret. They'd saved a life together. Whatever came next, they'd face as a team. The weeks following the rescue became a legal tornado that threatened to consume everyone involved. District Attorney Rebecca Morrison found herself caught between public pressure, political considerations, and her own conscience as she reviewed the case against Michael Jackson and his team. The evidence was contradictory in the worst way. Clear proof that laws had been broken, but equally clear proof that those laws had been broken to save a child from ongoing abuse. Morrison had built her career on law and order, on the principle that vigilante justice undermined the system, but she'd also dedicated her life to protecting victims. Now she had to decide whether to prosecute people who'd done what she wished the system had done first. Her office was flooded with calls demanding Michael's arrest or his exoneration in equal measure. Politicians weighed in with opinions designed to appeal to their bases. And through it all, Morrison had to make a decision that would define her career and possibly her legacy. Michael spent those weeks in a kind of suspended animation. He couldn't leave California while the investigation continued. His legal team advised against public appearances, but he refused to hide. He continued visiting Sophia with supervised permission, watched her begin the long process of healing with help from trauma specialists. Her mother had regained custody under strict conditions and supervision, having demonstrated genuine ignorance of the full extent of Castellano's abuse and commitment to protecting her daughter going forward. Sophia was attending therapy 3 times a week, slowly learning to be a child again instead of a victim. She'd started drawing pictures, colorful, happy images so different from the darkness she'd lived through. She gave Michael one of those drawings, a picture of 2 figures holding hands with the sun overhead. She'd labeled it Sophia and Michael, friends forever. He kept it with him always, a reminder why everything else was worth enduring. Richard Castellano's world had collapsed with stunning speed. Federal investigators had uncovered a web of abuse spanning 15 years and involving at least 7 children besides Sophia. Former employees came forward with testimonies about suspicious activities at Castellano's various properties. Financial investigators traced money to families who'd signed non-disclosure agreements, and several of those families began speaking to prosecutors once they understood they could break those agreements without financial ruin. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of a man who'd systematically used his wealth and position to prey on vulnerable children. Castellano was arrested on multiple counts of child abuse, sexual assault of a minor, and related charges. His bail was set astronomically high, but even his considerable wealth couldn't buy him freedom when the charges were this serious and the evidence this damning. He sat in county jail awaiting trial, his empire crumbling, his reputation destroyed, his future measured in decades of potential prison time. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Michael Jackson, who'd been falsely accused of child abuse years earlier, was now potentially facing prosecution for rescuing an actually abused child. The parallel was picked up by journalists, commentators, and social media users who pointed out the savage unfairness of a system that had hounded an innocent man while allowing a real predator to operate freely. Support for Michael grew as more details emerged about Castellano's crimes and the lengths Michael had gone to protect Sophia. Prominent attorneys offered to join his defense team pro bono. Child advocacy organizations established the Sophia's Voice Initiative to reform laws around mandatory reporting and to remove barriers that prevented authorities from acting on suspected abuse. The case had sparked a national conversation about how society protected its most vulnerable members and what ordinary citizens should do when official systems failed. District Attorney Morrison finally announced a decision at a press conference that drew international attention. She would not be filing criminal charges against Michael Jackson, James Chen, Tommy Rodriguez, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, or Nicole Hartley. Her reasoning was methodical and powerful. She acknowledged that laws had technically been broken, but argued that California's Defense of Others statute provided legal justification for their actions. More importantly, Morrison stated that prosecuting people for saving a child from ongoing abuse would send a chilling message to anyone who witnessed child endangerment. She referenced the evidence of Sophia's injuries, Castellano's history of abuse, and the documented failures of previous attempts to help through proper channels. While Morrison emphasized that she wasn't endorsing vigilantism, she recognized that extraordinary circumstances sometimes required extraordinary responses. Her voice was firm as she concluded that her office's resources would be dedicated to prosecuting Richard Castellano, not the people who'd exposed his crimes. The announcement sent shockwaves through legal circles and the general public. Some prosecutors and legal scholars criticized Morrison's decision as dangerous precedent that could encourage vigilante action. Others praised her moral courage in refusing to punish people for doing what was obviously right. For Michael and his team, the relief was profound but complicated. They'd avoided criminal prosecution, but civil suits still loomed. Castellano's lawyers had already filed a massive lawsuit claiming unlawful imprisonment, assault, property damage, and emotional distress. The legal battle was far from over, but at least they wouldn't be fighting from jail cells. Michael's first call after hearing the news was to Sophia, telling her they'd all be okay, that the people who'd helped save her weren't going to be punished. Her happiness and relief over the phone made everything worthwhile. She'd been carrying guilt, feeling responsible for the trouble her rescuers faced. Knowing they were safe lifted a burden from her small shoulders. Marcus used the attention generated by the case to launch something he'd been planning for years, a private security firm specializing in protecting vulnerable populations. His experience with Michael's rescue operation had reminded him why he joined law enforcement in the first place, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The firm will provide security for domestic violence shelters, help families escape dangerous situations, and work with law enforcement to bridge gaps in victim protection. Several FBI colleagues resigned to join him, frustrated by bureaucratic limitations that prevented them from doing more direct good. James signed on as head of tactical operations. Tommy became their technical director, using his security expertise to protect the vulnerable instead of the wealthy. They called the firm Guardian Shield, and their first major client was the organization running Sophia's Voice, providing security for abuse survivors who face threats from their abusers. Sarah's role in the rescue led to an unexpected opportunity. The hospital where she worked faced criticism for failing to properly investigate signs of Sophia's abuse, and in response, they established a comprehensive child abuse identification and reporting program with Sarah as its director. She developed training protocols for medical staff, created systems for documenting and reporting suspected abuse that bypassed potential corruption, and worked with law enforcement to ensure reports were properly investigated. Her program became a model adopted by hospitals across California and eventually nationwide. She often thought about how Sophia's bravery in speaking up had led to systemic changes that would protect countless other children. One voice, amplified by people willing to listen and act, had created ripples that spread far beyond that one rescue. Nicole expanded her advocacy work exponentially. The publicity from the case gave her a platform she'd never had before, and she used it relentlessly. She testified before state legislatures about reforming child protective systems, advocated for laws that made it easier to remove children from dangerous situations, and worked to close loopholes that allowed wealthy abusers to escape accountability. The Sophia's Voice initiative became a national movement, pushing for mandatory training for all professionals who work with children, increased funding for child protective services, and legal protections for people who reported abuse in good faith. Nicole's phone rang constantly with calls from other social workers, frustrated by systems that protected perpetrators, looking for guidance on how to fight back within and outside the system. She was exhausted but energized, finally seeing the possibility of real change emerging from tragedy. Michael's career took an unexpected turn. He'd expected the rescue to end what remained of his public life, anticipated that even vindication wouldn't restore his reputation. Instead, something different happened. People saw him differently now, not as the eccentric celebrity or the scandal-plagued tabloid fixture, but as someone who'd risked everything for a child. His music sales surged as new audiences discovered or rediscovered his work. But more importantly, his voice on child welfare issues carried weight it never had before. When he spoke about protecting children, people listened. When he advocated for reforms, legislators paid attention. He used this unexpected influence carefully, always deflecting attention to the issues rather than himself, always emphasizing that real heroes were people like Sarah, Nicole, and Marcus who did this work every day without headlines or recognition. The civil suit brought by Castellano dragged through courts for over a year. His lawyers argued that regardless of abuse allegations, Michael and his team had violated their client's rights through illegal entry and kidnapping. They sought millions in damages, hoping that even if Castellano faced criminal conviction, he could bankrupt those who would expose him. Michael's legal team countered with evidence of Castellano's crimes, arguing that he'd forfeited any right to damages by using his home to abuse children. The trial became a media circus, with daily coverage dissecting every piece of evidence and testimony. Sophia had to testify, though protections were in place to shield her from direct confrontation with her abuser. She was brave beyond her years, clearly describing what she'd endured while Castellano sat at the defense table refusing to meet her eyes. Her mother testified about the psychological manipulation she'd experienced, explaining how Castellano had isolated her and used financial control to prevent her from protecting her daughter. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict. They ruled in favor of Michael and his team on all counts, finding that Castellano's civil claims were invalidated by his own criminal conduct. Moreover, they issued a statement with their verdict, a rare occurrence, expressing their view that the defendants had acted heroically and that Castellano's lawsuit was an abuse of the legal system. The foreman read a statement acknowledging that while vigilante justice was generally wrong, there were rare circumstances where moral imperatives overrode legal technicalities. This was one of those circumstances. The courtroom erupted in applause, quickly gavelled down by the judge, but the message was clear. A jury of ordinary citizens had looked at all the evidence and concluded that Michael Jackson had done the right thing, legal complications notwithstanding. Castellano's lawyers immediately filed appeals, but the verdict stood, and with his criminal trial approaching, his prospects looked increasingly grim. 3 years after the rescue, Sophia attended a private ceremony at Neverland Ranch. She was 11 now, healthier than she'd been in that hospital bed, though trauma's shadows still occasionally darkened her eyes. She'd become an advocate herself, speaking to other abuse survivors in age-appropriate settings, showing them that healing was possible. Her mother stood beside her, having completed her own therapy and rebuilt her life away from Castellano's influence. They'd moved to a different state for a fresh start, but maintained contact with the team that had saved them. Sophia wore a dress she'd picked out herself, purple, her new favorite color because it reminded her of freedom and possibility. Michael greeted her with a hug, and she smiled that brilliant smile that made everything worthwhile. Around them gathered the others, Marcus, Sarah, James, Tommy, Nicole, and dozens more whose lives had been touched by that night 3 years ago. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Michael presented Sophia with a key, symbolic rather than functional, to a scholarship fund established in her name. The fund will provide education and support for child abuse survivors, helping them build futures unburdened by their pasts. Sophia accepted it with grace that seemed impossible for someone so young, then surprised everyone by asking to speak. She stood before the assembled group, this little girl who'd once been too terrified to raise her voice, and thanked them for seeing her when she'd been invisible. She thanked them for listening when she'd whispered her secret. She thanked them for being brave when she couldn't be. And she told them that because of what they'd done for her, she'd learned that one person could make a difference, that heroes weren't just in movies, and that sometimes keeping promises meant risking everything. Her words left many in tears, including Michael, who'd struggled for years with whether his fame had more often hurt or helped the causes he cared about. As the ceremony concluded and guests mingled, Michael found a quiet moment on Neverland's grounds, looking out over the estate he'd built as a sanctuary for childhood innocence. He thought about the journey that had led to this moment, the whispered confession in a hospital room, the desperate planning, the terrifying rescue, the legal battles, and finally this vindication. He thought about how close he'd come to ignoring Sophia's plea, to convincing himself that someone else should handle it, that getting involved would only make things worse given his tainted reputation. What if he'd looked away? What if he decided his own troubles were too heavy to take on someone else's? Sophia would still be suffering, or worse. Castellano would still be free, potentially harming other children. Sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing, the scariest thing, the thing that made no sense until years later when you could look back and see the lives change, the evil stopped, the hope restored. Sophia found him standing there and slipped her hand into his. They didn't speak for a long moment, just stood together watching the sunset paint Neverland in shades of gold. Finally, she broke the silence. She told him she'd started writing music, that Sarah had gotten her a keyboard and she was learning to play. She wondered if maybe someday she could write songs that helped people the way his music had helped her during her darkest times. Michael knelt down to her eye level, seeing in this brave young girl a future limited only by her imagination and courage. He told her she could be anything she wanted to be, that her past didn't define her future, and that he'd be there to support whatever dream she decided to chase. She hugged him then, and in that embrace was forgiveness, hope, and a kind of pure gratitude that no amount of fame or fortune could purchase. This moment, this child safe and healing, was worth every headline, every legal battle, every sleepless night. This was what mattered. The world never fully understood what happened that night 3 years ago. Conspiracy theories proliferated online. Documentaries dissected the event from every angle, and Michael's choice remained controversial in legal and ethical debates. But for those who'd been there, who'd seen Sophia's terror transform into hope, who'd watched Castellano's empire of abuse crumble, there was no doubt. They'd done something impossible and necessary. They'd proven that when systems fail, ordinary people could do extraordinary things. They'd shown that fame and resources could be used for genuine good, not just self-promotion. And they'd written a different ending to a story that should never have had to happen in the first place. As Michael watched Sophia rejoin her mother, saw her laugh at something James said, noticed her confidently interacting with people who once would have terrified her, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle or pain, but the deep satisfaction of knowing he'd kept his promise. He'd saved a little girl who trusted him with a terrible secret. Whatever else history would say about Michael Jackson, that truth would endure. In the end, when everything else was stripped away, he'd been there when it mattered most. He'd listened to a whisper and change a life. That was his real legacy, not record sold or award won, but a child given back her future. And that was more than enough.